400,000 men died not in a war against a foreign enemy, not against an empire that came to invade their lands. They died fighting against their own brothers, their own neighbors, in some cases against their own father. The American Civil War was the most devastating war the United States has ever fought. And the most disturbing thing of all is that no one, absolutely no one, believed it would go that far. In April of 1861, a country built on the idea of freedom split into two halves that hated each other with a ferocity no political speech could contain anymore. And what followed was 4 years of a hell so deep, so personal, so absurd in its cruelty, that even today, more than 160 years later, the United States carries those scars in its collective soul. But to understand why this happened, you need to understand something that will surprise you. It did not start with a gunshot. It started with cotton. In the decades before the war, the South of the United States was an economic machine built on a single foundation: slavery. More than 4 million people lived as property on plantations in Virginia, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, and the other southern states. 4 million human beings who could not choose where to live, whom to marry, or whether the next day they would be sold to another owner in another state thousands of kilometers away. The historian James McPherson, in his classic work on this period, described the Southern slave system as one of the most brutal institutions any Western society has sustained in modern times. And yet, for the Southern elite, it was simply the natural order of things. They did not question it. They defended it with economic, religious, and philosophical arguments built over entire generations. The North, meanwhile, was industrializing at a ferocious speed. Factories, railroads, millions of immigrants arriving to work in the cities of New York, Boston, Chicago. Two completely different worlds sharing the same flag, the same anthem, and increasingly fewer common values. And the tension between those two worlds had been building for decades like steam in a sealed boiler, with no escape valve, and no one with enough political courage to open it in a controlled way before everything exploded. There were attempts at negotiation, legislative compromises that kicked the problem forward without solving it. The Missouri Compromise in 1820, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, all were patches on a wound that kept getting infected. Every time Congress reached an agreement, both sides left dissatisfied and more convinced that the other side was irreconcilable. And in the Western territories, where it was debated whether new states would be slave or free, violence had already begun long before any formal army entered combat. In Kansas, pro-slavery and abolitionist groups clashed in attacks and reprisals that left entire towns burned. Newspapers of the time called it Bleeding Kansas, and no one in Washington knew how to stop it. When Abraham Lincoln won the presidency in November 1860, something broke definitively. Lincoln was not a radical abolitionist. That must be made absolutely clear. He was a man who believed slavery was a moral evil. Yes, but in his early political career, he had repeated that he had no intention of touching it where it already existed. What the South feared about Lincoln was not so much what he promised to do, but what he represented. He was a Northern man elected without a single electoral vote from the South, and his victory meant something terrifying for the Southern states. That the balance of political power was changing, and that their interests, and with them their economy built on forced labor, were beginning to lose ground irreversibly. They did not wait even a month. South Carolina seceded from the Union in December of that same year. By February 1861, 6 more states had followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. Together, they formed the Confederate States of America with Jefferson Davis as president and a constitution that explicitly guaranteed the right to own slaves. They did not hide it. They put it in writing with a clarity that left no room for alternative interpretations. Alexander Stephens, the Confederate vice president, gave a speech in March of that year that history recorded as the Cornerstone Speech, where he declared bluntly that slavery was the cornerstone on which the new nation was built. That is not a later interpretation. Those are his exact words. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, a Union garrison in Charleston Bay, South Carolina. 34 hours of bombardment, with no direct casualties that first day. But the message was absolutely clear. The war had begun. And what neither the North nor the South understood at that moment was that they would need 4 years and hundreds of thousands of lives to end it. At the beginning, both sides were sure this would last weeks. The South believed the North had no stomach for fighting, that Yankee soldiers were city men without the toughness needed for a real war. The North believed the South would collapse quickly without the industrial support of the rest of the country, that without enough factories or railroads, the Confederacy could not sustain an army for long. Both were wrong in such an absolute way that it is dizzying to think about it from here. Northern civilians arrived at the first major battle, Bull Run, in July 1861, in carriages with picnic baskets as if they were going to watch a summer spectacle outside Washington. Senators, society ladies, journalists with their notebooks. What they saw left them frozen for the rest of their lives. The Union troops, poorly organized and worse led, were crushed by the Confederates and fled in disarray toward the capital. The civilians fled with them, mixed with the soldiers in a caravan of panic and shame that reached Washington at dusk. There was no picnic, only the first blow of reality of a war that was going to be much longer and much darker than anyone had imagined. The Confederacy had something the North took too long to adequately recognize: extraordinary generals. Robert E. Lee is perhaps the best-known name of the entire war, a man who personally rejected command of the Union Army, offered by General Winfield Scott himself, because he could not betray his native state, Virginia. He wrote to his sister in a letter that he considered secession a disastrous political mistake, but that he also could not raise his sword against his land, his family, his home. That contradiction defines him like few things. And then he commanded the Confederate Army with tactical precision and calculated audacity that left his opponents disoriented battle after battle. Thomas Stonewall Jackson, his right hand and perhaps the most feared commander in the Eastern Theater of the war, was a man of almost supernatural intensity. A university professor before the war, deeply religious, eccentric in his habits to the point that his own soldiers told stories about him with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. He marched his troops so fast and so far, covering distances that military manuals of the time considered impossible, that federal soldiers grimly joked that Jackson multiplied himself because he appeared simultaneously in places where it was physically impossible for him to be at the same time. He died in May 1863 from friendly fire in the darkness of Chancellorsville, right after one of his most brilliant victories. Lee said upon receiving the news that he had lost his right arm, he did not say it figuratively, but the North had something the South could never fully compensate for, no matter how many military geniuses it had: resources. The North produced 92% of the country's iron, 97% of its firearms, and had more than double the kilometers of railroad than the Confederacy. Its population was almost double. It could replace its casualties with new recruits in a way that the South, with a much smaller human reserve, simply could not match. That, in a war that would last years, was an advantage no tactical genius could sustain indefinitely. The mathematics of war is brutal and does not negotiate with bravery. The year 1862 was the darkest in terms of scale and collective psychological shock. Battles followed one another with a ferocity no one had anticipated. Shiloh in April left more than 23,000 casualties in 2 days. 2 days. Military doctors worked nonstop for 48-hour stretches. Field surgeons' testimonies from Shiloh describe piles of amputated limbs outside medical tents reaching the height of an adult man's hip. I'm not telling you this to impress you. I am telling you this because you need to understand what kind of reality that generation of Americans faced, who just months before had believed this would be quick and clean. Antietam in September of that same year was the bloodiest single day in all of United States military history. 23,000 casualties in one single day. One single day of combat in the fields of Maryland left more dead and wounded than all Americans fallen in the War of Independence combined. Photographer Alexander Gardner arrived days later and documented the unburied corpses on the battlefield. When those photographs were exhibited in New York, people lined up in the street to see them. It was the first time Northern civilians saw with their own eyes in real images, not idealized illustrations, what their war was really producing. And in that context of unprecedented devastation, Lincoln made the decision that would change not only the war, but the country's history forever. On January 1st, 1863, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. With that document, he declared free all slaves in the states in rebellion against the Union. Precision matters here because it is important. Lincoln had no direct legal authority over the Confederate States, so the proclamation did not free anyone immediately or automatically. Slaves in border states that remained in the Union, like Kentucky and Missouri, were not included. It was a measure designed with political and constitutional care. But what it did do was irreversibly transform the moral meaning of the war. It was no longer just a conflict to preserve the political union. It was a war to end slavery. And that changed everything else. Thousands of African-American men who until then could not serve in the Union Army began enlisting en masse. By the end of the war, more than 180,000 black soldiers had fought under the federal flag, organized in units like the famous 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. Many fought knowing perfectly well that if captured by Confederates, the Richmond government had ordered they not be treated as prisoners of war, but returned to slavery or executed on the spot. They fought anyway. With that, I tell you everything you need to know about how seriously they took what was at stake. July 1863, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. 3 days that decided the course of the war in a way none of the 250,000 men who participated could have fully anticipated. Lee had taken his Confederate Army north in a monumental gamble. If he won on northern soil, he could force a peace negotiation and international recognition of the Confederacy by Great Britain and France. The Union Army, now commanded by George Meade, a general who had been in charge for only 3 days when the battle began, waited for him in a small Pennsylvania town neither side had deliberately chosen as a battlefield. They met almost by accident, and the clash was of such magnitude that it shook the earth for kilometers around. The first day favored the Confederates. The second day was on a knife's edge, with fighting in places whose names became etched in American collective memory. Little Round Top, the Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field. On the third day, Lee ordered what history knows as Pickett's Charge. Nearly 12,000 Confederate soldiers formed in perfect lines, crossed almost 1.5 kilometers of open field under Federal artillery and infantry fire toward well-defended positions on Cemetery Ridge. It was one of the boldest, most desperate, and most tragic decisions of the entire war. Many of his own Confederate generals warned Lee it was impossible. Lee trusted his men in a way that bordered on religious faith. In less than an hour, more than half of those 12,000 men had fallen. Those who reached the stone wall marking the Union lines were repulsed in close quarters combat so short that men could see each other's faces. General Armistead, one of the charge's commanders, crossed the wall with his hat on the tip of his sword and fell wounded meters from the cannons he tried to capture. He died 2 days later. Lee waited the next day for a counterattack that never came and then ordered retreat under the rain. His army decimated, his invincibility shattered forever. He would never set foot on northern soil again. That same July 4th, as Lee began his retreat from Pennsylvania 15 kilometers to the south, the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi, fell to the Union after a 47-day siege in which citizens trapped inside had resorted to living in caves dug into hillside slopes to escape constant bombardment. General Ulysses Grant delivered to Lincoln total control of the Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in two halves that could no longer communicate or supply each other effectively. In 48 hours, the war turned in a way with no going back, but it did not end. That is what you must remember engraved. Nearly 2 more years of a war that remained brutal, every day, relentless. The South knew mathematically it was hard to win on the battlefield, but it bet on something different and calculated: the political exhaustion of the North. If they could make Northern citizens sick enough of the casualties, war taxes, forced conscription, perhaps in the 1864 elections, they would choose someone other than Lincoln, someone willing to negotiate, someone willing to let the South go in peace. Lincoln, in the summer of that year, was convinced he would lose re-election. He wrote it in a sealed memorandum he asked his cabinet to sign without opening, preserving for posterity his own forecast of defeat. The Democratic candidate, General George McClellan, former Union Army commander whom Lincoln had dismissed for excessive caution, promised to seek peace, and polls of the time gave him the advantage. The situation was so delicate that even Lincoln anticipated it with an honesty that speaks better of him than any monument. But then something happened that no one expected at the exact moment it was needed. General William Tecumseh Sherman captured Atlanta in September 1864, a city that was the industrial and railroad heart of the Confederacy, a symbol of Southern resistance believed impregnable. Its fall changed Northern mood so dramatically and quickly that Lincoln won re-election with an overwhelming majority. The North decided it wanted to end the war by winning it, not negotiating a surrender that would leave everything unresolved. What Sherman did next is one of the most controversial and studied pages of the entire war: his march to the sea. A 350-kilometer campaign from Atlanta to Savannah on the Georgia coast was an operation of systematic destruction designed with a very concrete purpose: to break the civilian will of the Confederacy, destroying its ability to sustain the war. His army of 60,000 men advanced in a swath of destruction 60 kilometers wide, dismantling railroads, burning supply depots, confiscating livestock and crops. Sherman said it explicitly and bluntly: "You war must be felt in people's homes, so they understand that continuing to resist has a real and immediate cost." His critics accused him of unnecessary brutality. His defenders argued that he shortened the war by months and saved more lives than it cost. The historiographical debate on that question is still not fully closed. On April 9th, 1865, in a small and modestly furnished room in the home of Wilmer McLean at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, Robert E. Lee sat facing Ulysses Grant and signed the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia. The terms were surprisingly generous, a direct reflection of Lincoln's will not to humiliate the South in defeat. Confederate officers could keep their swords. Soldiers who had horses could take them home because, as Grant said, they would need them for spring planting. There were no prisoner parades, no executions of rebel leaders, only the silent, almost intimate end of 4 years of something no word can fully describe with exactness. Union soldiers began to cheer when word of the surrender spread. Grant immediately ordered them to be silent. He said the Confederates were now his countrymen again, and that it was not right to celebrate over them. That small, almost forgotten gesture says more about how peace was meant to be built than many speeches. Lincoln did not live to see the reconstruction he had planned so much and thought about so deeply. 5 days after Lee's surrender, while attending a performance at Ford's Theater in Washington, he was shot in the head by John Wilkes Booth, a fanatical Confederate actor who had organized a plot to simultaneously eliminate the Vice President and the Secretary of State that same night. Only the attack on Lincoln succeeded completely. He died the next day, April 15, 1865, at 7:22 in the morning. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, standing beside the bed where Lincoln drew his last breath, said quietly something recorded by several witnesses present: "Now he belongs to the ages." The man who had held the country in his hands during its 4 darkest years did not see the dawn of what came after. The war left between 600,000 and 750,000 people dead, according to the most recent estimates. Historian J. David Hacker published in 2011 an exhaustive demographic analysis that revised the figures significantly upward from traditional calculations, using census data from the time to measure excess male mortality in the period. That revised number surpasses all Americans fallen in the First World War, the Second World War, Korea, and Vietnam combined. That number is not an abstract statistic. It is an entire generation that disappeared from records, from families, from towns left full of widows and fatherless children on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. And yet, the end of the war did not resolve everything. It could not. Slavery was formally abolished with the 13th Amendment in December 1865. But the Reconstruction years that followed were a political battlefield as fierce and determining than anything that had occurred in the 4 previous years. Southern legislatures passed the so-called Black Codes almost immediately, laws designed to reconstruct slavery conditions under a different name. The Ku Klux Klan was founded in 1865 by Confederate veterans. Racial segregation laws, known as Jim Crow laws, dominated the South for almost a century more. The war ended. The struggle continued for generations. What impresses me most about all this And perhaps the most disturbing when you stop to think about it is that a nation built chanting the ideals of freedom and equality took almost 100 more years to begin applying them in a real way with effective legal backing. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s was in many ways the battle the Civil War could not finish. Martin Luther King understood it perfectly. His speeches are full of direct references to Lincoln, to the Emancipation Proclamation, to the outstanding debt of a promise the country had signed but not fulfilled. The American Civil War was not the end of anything. It was the violent and traumatic beginning of a conversation about who we are and what it means to belong to this nation. A conversation the United States is still having today in its streets, in its courts, in its ballots, more than 160 years later. And if this history teaches us anything with a clarity that admits no doubt, it is that great fractures in a society do not appear out of nowhere. They are built slowly with decades of ignored injustices, deferred tensions because no one wants to pay the political cost of facing them, conflicts inherited from generation to generation without resolution, and when they finally explode, they do so in a way no one who was there before the first shot could have fully imagined. The war that divided the United States in two did not start at Fort Sumter. It started much earlier, in every plantation, in every congressional hall where comfortable compromise was preferred over brave decision. Every time someone chose silence in the face of something they knew was wrong, and it perhaps ends in a place we have not yet fully reached. The question I leave you with is this: how many of the fractures we live with today are we also postponing, waiting for someone else to resolve them, without seeing that every time we do, the boiler rises 1 degree more?